Hi everyone! Welcome back to EconomicStory-Channel, where we share fascinating stories and knowledge about economics. There are periods in history when every political decision and every central bank policy quietly stacks up like bricks, building a collective nightmare. The 1970s was one such nightmare. Inflation soared, and unemployment surged alongside it. This phenomenon, dubbed stagflation, was something economics had never named before. No one knew where it came from or how to deal with it. All the theories taught in the lecture halls of Harvard or Yale suddenly became useless. For 3 decades after World War II, John Maynard Keynes was the beacon guiding modern economics. He was the savior of the world during the Great Depression of 1929 and the father of Keynesian economics, which argued that when the economy slows, the government must spend. When people are fearful, the central bank must lower interest rates to boost confidence. Keynesian theory was once revered as gospel. From the UK to France to the US, no policymaker dared question it. But then, in the 1970s, everything began to crumble. Government spending to stimulate demand had no effect. Lowering interest rates to boost employment didn't work either. All it did was make inflation worse. The more they tried, the stronger this phenomenon became. Every Keynesian tool backfired. Stagflation didn't just cause an economic crisis. It toppled an entire ideological system. So, what did the U.S. do when the old truths no longer worked? What theories did economists of the 1970s propose? And what did politicians do to pull the U.S. out of this quagmire? That's the question we'll explore in today's podcast by stepping back into the past, examining each link in the chain that led to the nightmare called stagflation. Let's begin. The roots of the crisis. It all started with President Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, serving from 1963 to 1969, succeeding President John F. Kennedy after his assassination in 1963. Johnson launched 2 ambitious programs to transform America, but ended up laying the foundation for the greatest post-war fiscal crisis. First was the Vietnam War, an exorbitantly costly conflict. Escalating in 1965, hundreds of thousands of American troops were sent to Vietnam. Defense spending skyrocketed, but Johnson avoided raising taxes, fearing public backlash. Instead, the government borrowed heavily and indirectly pressured the Federal Reserve to print money to finance the war. This caused a massive increase in the money supply, planting the seeds for future inflation. Second was the Great Society program, launched alongside the Vietnam War escalation in 1965. Johnson rolled out a series of social welfare policies, Medicaid, education support, and poverty alleviation. These embodied Johnson's progressive societal dream, but were built on a mountain of debt amidst a nation mired in war. The only solution at the time was to print money. Printing money recklessly, with no regard for the ballooning budget deficit, led to a complete loss of fiscal balance. The clear consequence was creeping inflation starting in the late 1960s. Countries holding dollars began losing faith in the U.S. currency and rushed to exchange them for gold under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Gold was drained from the U.S. at an alarming rate, severely undermining the dollar's position. These were the landmines Johnson left behind. The one to detonate them was his successor, Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States. Serving from 1969 to 1974, Nixon made the historic decision to abandon the gold standard in 1971, shattering the Bretton Woods system that had existed for 27 years from July 1944 to August 1971. Additionally, Nixon faced the 1973 oil crisis, when oil prices quadrupled in just a few months. This fueled a surge in production and transportation costs, causing consumer prices to spiral uncontrollably, devastating households and businesses. 3 factors converged simultaneously. The Fed's massive money printing from Johnson's era led to severe fiscal imbalances. Gold was rapidly withdrawn from Fort Knox as countries doubted the dollar's value, forcing Nixon to abandon Bretton Woods and the gold standard, and the 1973 oil crisis shock. Together, they created an era of high inflation and high unemployment, marking the dawn of stagflation in America. The Watergate Scandal. In 1972, amid President Nixon's re-election campaign as the Republican candidate, 5 strangers broke into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Hotel to plant listening devices, but were caught red-handed. Initially thought to be a minor burglary, the FBI traced the money funding the break-in and discovered it came from Nixon's re-election campaign fund, meaning Nixon's team had hired these individuals to spy on opponents. Sensing trouble, Nixon quickly ordered the CIA, an agency meant for foreign operations, to pressure the FBI to halt the investigation, citing national security. This was a blatant abuse of power. The CIA had no domestic jurisdiction, yet somehow it was used to silence the FBI. From there, Watergate was no longer just a break-in, but a high-level cover-up operation, where a president used national security tools to cling to power. Ultimately, secret White House audio tapes were exposed. Nixon was forced to resign in 1974, the first and only time in U.S. history a president stepped down midterm. Gerald Ford's tenure. Gerald Ford, Nixon's successor, became the 38th President of the United States, serving from 1974 to 1977. Thrust into office unelected and unexpected, Ford inherited a chaotic legacy. The U.S. had just withdrawn from the Vietnam War, a costly conflict that drained untold resources. B-52 bombers were shot down by Vietnamese forces, scrapped for aluminum to make rings, polished to shine on the hand of Le G.C. during Paris peace talks with Henry Kissinger. Each time Thurr brushed his hair or waved to reporters, Kissinger saw the gleaming rings, a painful reminder of the dollars and American prestige buried in Indochina. The U.S. was not only in economic crisis, but also suffered a profound loss of trust in government. Ford didn't shy away from the truth. He bluntly identified the twin enemies ravaging America: inflation and unemployment. He declared this a fight for survival, but all efforts to stimulate the economy were like pouring salt into the sea, unable to stop the storm of stagflation. The seeds of this upheaval were sown by Arthur Burns, who remained firmly in his throne as Fed chairman. Burns, not only the Fed chairman, but also Nixon's close friend and longtime economic advisor, had aggressively cut interest rates and pumped money into the economy during Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign, creating an illusion of growth to secure Nixon's victory. The price was runaway inflation, a near collapse of faith in the dollar, and ultimately stagflation, the nightmare of soaring prices and skyrocketing unemployment. During Ford's term, Burns hesitated, believing that controlling government spending without sharply raising interest rates could tame inflation. This was a mistaken and costly belief. Jimmy Carter's challenges. The U.S. had no time to recover from Ford's failures. In 1977, Jimmy Carter entered the White House as the 39th president, carrying hopes of reviving America. But he didn't realize he was taking the wheel of a train already off the tracks. All the mistakes accumulated over the previous decade: loose monetary policy, uncontrolled fiscal spending, a draining war, and political interference distorting the central banking system began erupting simultaneously. It wasn't a single explosion, but a chain reaction spreading across the economy. The final spark came from the 1979 Iranian Revolution. When the US-backed Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini seized power, Iran descended into chaos. As a major oil exporter, Iran's production halt triggered a global supply crisis. The international energy market panicked. OPEC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, seized the opportunity to more than double crude oil prices in under 2 years, from about $15 per barrel in 1978 to nearly $1.40 by early 1980. The consequences quickly rippled through the U.S. economy. Gas prices surged, leading to long lines at gas stations, sometimes stretching for miles. To manage the situation, states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, and New Jersey introduced odd-even rationing based on license plate numbers. Some states capped gas purchases at $5 or $10, forcing people to wake up early or line up at midnight to secure fuel before it ran out. Transportation, production, and raw material costs skyrocketed, leading businesses to cut output or go bankrupt en masse. Economic growth nearly froze, unemployment spread, the dollar lost value significantly, and panic gripped the public, eroding trust in both the government and the financial system. This was the second major shock in less than a decade, following the financial turmoil of the early 1970s. In this context, the Federal Reserve reacted sluggishly, riddled with internal conflicts and unsure of the path forward. The Fed chairman at the time, G. William Miller, was terrified of sharply raising interest rates, fearing it would choke growth. As a result, nominal interest rates rose, but real rates remained negative due to runaway inflation, causing money to flee bonds and further weakening the dollar. Why did the dollar weaken? Why did money flow out of U.S. government bonds at that time? Let me explain in more detail. In the late 1970s, specifically 1979, when G. William Miller was Fed chairman from May 8, 1978 to August 6, 1979, inflation had soared past 11%, while unemployment neared 6%. Before Miller took office, the federal funds rate was around 7 to 8%. With inflation exceeding 11%, Miller tried pushing rates to 10 to 11% in 1979. However, despite the high nominal rates, inflation refused to budge. Real interest rates, after accounting for inflation, remained negative because inflation outpaced rate hikes. Investors began pulling money out of bonds. Even though bank deposits or government bonds offered seemingly high interest, they were losing value because inflation eroded returns faster. This is what Milton Friedman had sharply criticized in earlier lectures. Let's revisit a short excerpt. The government reaps revenue from inflation by defaulting on its debt obligations. Many worry about public debt, but that's not what you should worry about. Government debt publicly declared bonds and similar debts as a percentage of national income is smaller than it was 20 to 30 years ago. How can that be with annual budget deficits? Because these aren't real deficits. They're deficits financed by inflation. Anyone who bought government securities over the past decade paid the government for the privilege of lending it money. Those who redeemed long-term bonds received money worth less in real terms, buying fewer goods and services than their initial investment. To add insult to injury, they had to pay taxes on the so-called interest. As a result, public debt has significantly decreased, making inflation a brilliant tool for the government. When inflation outpaces nominal interest rates, even with interest, depositors lose value as real interest rates are negative, prompting investors to flee. Money left U.S. bonds for gold, real estate, or assets in countries offering higher yields. As more people sold dollars, the dollar's value weakened daily. That's why the dollar faltered at the time. The Stagflation Crisis. In the 1970s, stagflation, high inflation coupled with high unemployment, was initially seen as temporary. By the decade's end, it was no longer a seasonal fever, but a chronic disease afflicting the U.S. economy. Inflation exceeded 11%. Unemployment neared 6%. Nominal interest rates hit 10 to 11%, but real rates remained negative. Those holding cash or investing in bonds were like clutching a burning coal. The S&P 500 stumbled sideways through 1980, dropped nearly 10% in 1981, and fell another 15% by early 1982. The market declined severely, and investors lost patience with half-hearted policies, fueling widespread panic. Faith in the dollar collapsed, gold prices soared to nearly $850 per ounce, an unprecedented shock. The market was in chaos, confidence evaporated, and both Wall Street and Main Street lived in prolonged, nameless fear. Prices rose, wallets stayed empty, jobs were precarious, and interest rates obeyed no one. Paul Volcker's Revolution. In this context, in August 1979, Jimmy Carter appointed a little-known figure, Paul Volcker, as the new Fed chairman. Tall, chain-smoking cigars, with a stone-cold demeanor, Volcker feared neither Wall Street's criticism nor congressional pressure. Volcker didn't enter the Fed as a typical policymaker, but as a silent executioner, carrying out the sentence Milton Friedman had written nearly a decade earlier. From the 1960s to 1970s, Friedman relentlessly attacked Fed policies. He asserted, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. You cannot control inflation by manipulating interest rates. Only controlling the money supply addresses the root cause. In a famous 1978 New York University speech, Friedman sharply criticized prolonged low interest rates for exacerbating inflation. Each time the Fed softened, inflation returned stronger. To eradicate inflation, a shock therapy was needed, sacrificing short-term growth to establish long-term expectations. In simple terms, to save the dollar, inflation expectations had to be crushed. This philosophy shaped Volcker's actions. He wasn't alone, but was the executioner of Friedman's verdict. Upon taking office, Volcker discarded outdated economic textbooks and abandoned the Fed's old method of tweaking interest rates quarterly. Instead, he announced a shift to controlling the money supply, targeting the growth rates of M1 and M2, aligning with Friedman's monetarism model from the optimum quantity of money and subsequent works. When Volcker became Fed chairman in August 1979, the federal funds rate was around 11%. Initially, Volcker cautiously tightened monetary policy, pushing rates to 13.7% by December 1979 and 17.6% by April 1980. But inflation remained stubborn, soaring to a peak of 14.8% in March 1980. A slight tightening caused a severe recession. Volcker was forced to slash rates from May to July 1980 to below 9%, trying to save the market before the economy collapsed further. But he realized that loose monetary policy was like bandaging a tumor. Inflation didn't just persist, it thrived. By mid-1981, Volcker launched a bold policy pushing the federal funds rate to 20%, peaking at 20.5%, strangling the economy to kill persistent inflation, creating the most significant monetary shock in modern economic history. This wasn't a spontaneous move, but a bloody, years-long campaign. The Fed coldly declared, "We choose to sacrifice jobs, plunge Main Street into recession, accept widespread negative impacts, and ignore the public's cries as long as we save the dollar and break the habit of living with inflation." In the short term, Main Street suffered devastating consequences. Small businesses and the working class were hit hard. Farmers surrounded the Fed's headquarters with tractors, demanding Volcker be tried as a traitor. They couldn't understand why they had to suffer to fix a disease caused by the financial system. Labor unions wailed, questioning why inflation was fought by choking workers. People lost jobs, homes, and faith, falling like autumn leaves. To many, the Fed was no longer a central bank, but a cult ready to burn the public to sacrifice for the dollar. Volcker was called the executioner of Main Street, but the savior of Wall Street. One hand raised interest rates, the other clung to Friedman's doctrine that tightening the money supply would force inflation to submit. The long-term outcome. But what about the long term? Inflation dropped from 13% to under 4%. The dollar rose like a phoenix. Wall Street popped champagne, while Main Street limped through the wreckage of the American dream. Survivors emerged from the carnage and hailed Volcker as the savior of free markets. This laid the foundation for Reaganomics, which I'll cover in future podcast episodes. The world tipped its hat. Keynesian theory, once the guiding star of post-war economics, was deemed outdated and discarded like an obsolete relic. Monetarism was elevated as the new truth after the stagflation earthquake, enshrined as the supreme doctrine of an independent monetary era, where controlling the money supply was believed to rein in inflation. The cost was millions of jobs, thousands of businesses wiped out, and an entire generation's hopes frozen. But what lay behind this victory? Mass unemployment, widespread bankruptcies, and the quiet disintegration of the middle class, the pillar that once upheld America. It was an unspoken but understood declaration. We're willing to sacrifice Main Street to save Wall Street, to trade millions of lives to protect the dollar and keep the market's wheels turning. That's why we pause today's podcast here to reflect on a bigger question. Was stagflation truly an economic accident, or was it a meticulously designed tool to reshape the global order? I once believed stagflation was just a sad chapter in economic history, but perhaps I was wrong. In the next episode of Economic Story Channel, I'll tell you what the elites never wanted outsiders to know, the truths hidden for decades. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you found this content helpful, please share it with those who need it, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to support Economic Story Channel and help it reach more people. Thank you for your support. Wishing you a day full of energy. Wishing you a day full of energy.